This is Exolegacy, the aggregate Book 1 by Conrad Altmann, read by the author. For my father, who stoked my passion for writing and imagination from a young age. Chapter 1. The Wake. Alson and his siblings met at the bar of Hotel Contact at Unity Station. They had all traveled to be here for this particular event. Their father had been an important man, perhaps not the father most children would hope for, but certainly something to live up to as an adult, which they were all now. Hildy hadn't traveled as far as the others, since she lived only a few stops away at the university where she had become a researcher of some renown in the field of geochemistry. Ehrenfeld followed more closely in their father's footsteps and had become a bureaucrat, but had stayed behind on Earth. It wasn't as prestigious as becoming the first ambassador to the Manisae, as their father had, but he seemed to find fulfillment, if not meaning, in it. Alson had been the black sheep of the family. Even though he had gone to university like his siblings, he had skipped out on the first sniff of adventure and never looked back. His father had stopped bothering him about it years ago, which Alson guessed was his quiet way of acceptance, if not approval, for the man he had become. None of the three children of the late Ambassador Hernandez had had children. It would have caused their mother no end of grief if she had not preceded her husband by nearly a decade. Humanity had learned to cure a myriad of diseases, but there was still none for unexpected aneurysms, and so, as they sat at the bar of the hotel that would host their father's wake and eventual reading of his will, the realization that the three of them were all that was left of this prestigious man slowly sank in. The wake was attended by some of the biggest names in industry and politics that had been available to attend since Ambassador Hernandez passed suddenly 2 weeks prior. It would have been a prime opportunity to fish for any connections one might want, but Alson was preoccupied. As he sipped his tequila, something his father had drunk, but he had never learned the knack of, he ruminated on the old man's life. As the youngest, Alson had occupied a special place in his father's heart, even if he was assigned to his position when Alson was young. This meant that Alson had grown up loving the man that had been his father, but even more being the son of the great ambassador. It was no wonder the pressure eventually got to him, causing him to run for the mountains. "How does it taste?" Hildy asked him as she held her own more palatable drink. "I know he drank it, but you don't have to impress anyone. I see how you flinch every time you swallow." "It's not about impressing anyone, Hildy," he responded. "I'm trying to get in his shoes a bit. I know I don't have to drink it, but it's the last time I think I have to be close to him, so I will." To this she had no response. She had loved him in her own way and understood small acts of respect. The eldest, Ehrenfeld, only held water in his hand as he sat on the other side of the table. Stoic as ever, he bore a striking resemblance to their father, so much so that he had been asked to pose for a commissioned portrait to be hung in Das Parlament back in Wien, with a smaller version gifted to the family. What was left of it, anyway. Alson and Hildy expected that it would hang in Ehrenfeld's Stadthaus. All they would see when looking at it would be their brother anyway. An aged but stock-straight woman in a smart pantsuit approached the podium. Alson recognized her as Admiral Hildegard Chaula, Sekretärin of the Außenministerium of the Staatenbund, or, in more common parlance, the Secretary of the Foreign Ministry of the Confederation. She was no doubt the highest-ranking government official in attendance, but the three siblings knew her simply as Auntie Hildy, their sister's namesake. Taking the microphone, she began her address. "Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and honored Manisae guests to our celebration of the life and work of the late Ambassador Álvaro Hernandez. This place, in particular, the dust under our feet precisely, is where he and I took our historic first steps toward the third contact ceremony with our honored neighbors, the Manisae. That was nearly 60 years ago now, and Álvaro Hernandez's work as first a scientist and then the ambassador helped to build the firm foundations of respect and cooperation with the Manisae we enjoy today." The Secretarian continued with a few anecdotes of how she had come to know his father, as was the tradition at these sorts of functions, but Alson tuned most of it out, preferring his own thoughts to the memories of others. One after the other, human and Manisae dignitaries and industrial titans stood and addressed the congregation, building his father's life and legend until there was no one left who had anything to say. Looking to avoid unwanted condolences and confrontations with their father's old acquaintances, the three siblings made their excuses and gracefully exited toward the elevator bank in the lobby. The next part of this day was specifically for the three of them. The legal ceremony would divide up their father's holdings and physical treasures between the three of them. Altmann didn't think that any of them needed the money. Both Hildy and Ehrenfeld had lucrative holdings and incomes from their work, and while he wasn't rich, he had made do with what he had made for himself, and was satisfied with the small luxuries it afforded. Auntie Hildy, as the executor of their father's will, met them at the elevator on the penthouse floor and led them solemnly toward his suite. The air had a heavy and slightly musty feel to it, despite the scrubbers. The collection of old books and knickknacks on their father's shelves added to the unique smell. Once they had been ushered into overused armchairs and offered refreshment, she took her place behind the real teak desk that stood as a monolith in the otherwise austere office. Thank you all for making the time and effort to be here for this reading. It was your father's fervent wish to be able to have you together for this reading of his last will. Fervent wasn't a word that any of the siblings could imagine their father portraying, but for each of them he was a different person. He might also have been with his old friend and colleague. She read out the allotments of the late ambassador's financial funds, mainly inherited from investments that their mother had retained from some unknown family connection or inheritance of her own. Once that was finished, she read the bequeathment of the various properties that had stayed in the family's holdings. To Ehrenfeld went the Stadthaus in Wien, which satisfied him fine, not that his face showed it. He had been living in it for the past 20 years anyway. To Hildy, the suite that they were sitting in presently, which had been the ambassador's residence when on Luna. And finally to Altmann, the estate on Tiras, formerly known as Mars, his father's last residence as ambassador to the Manisae people. They had constructed for him a living space befitting his position. Altmann felt as if he should be looking for hidden cameras, waiting to catch his reaction to the cruel joke. He had never been off of Earth, except for this event, nor did he particularly desire to. In his own words, not that he was afraid of space travel either. It had come a long way since his father's day, and it was much more reliable and faster since the inclusion of Manisae tech. But the complete unexpectedness of the gift set his mind reeling. He didn't have much to return to on Earth, but for the solitude he had managed to curate for himself. That would probably be something he wouldn't have for a while now, and he would probably have to make arrangements directly from here to claim his inheritance. His mind buzzed with the implications that this would have on his future. Finally came the Erinnerungsgeschenk, the gifting of memories. The ritual was borrowed and adapted from the Manisae, fitting given their father's peculiarities and station, but it had caught on in certain circles among humanity as a way of sharing the life of a loved one. The Manisae had taught humanity many things since settling on Mars and renaming it to Tiras 60 years ago, thrusting humanity into galactic culture whether it was ready or not. Debatably, one of the most important gifts of technology was related to the storage and transfer of memories from one being to another. Despite the obvious physiological differences between humans and Manisae, their minds worked in remarkably similar ways, so adapting their technology in this instance had not required too many years of development and testing. The secretarian continued after placing 3 identical, cloudy, dark gray crystals on the desktop, cushioned by 3 small pieces of green felt. Each of these centite crystals contain memories from your father's life. One contains his childhood, the next his young adult years, and finally his later years. He wished for each of you to take possession of one for reasons that he intended would become clear to you as you have access to them. The crystals closest to you are yours to take at this time, but I would advise you to handle them using the felt that they are resting on until the moment you're ready to interact with them. She continued, you will realize that there may be certain years or events missing, perhaps not for the crystal containing his childhood left to Ehrenfeld, but the others may contain periods that have been redacted by the Staatenbund for matters of security. I hope you will all understand the reasoning behind this. Thank you for your time and my condolences. She stood and slowly left them to each other in the office, staring at the 3 objects on the desk. Hildy reached for the center crystal first. Well, I think I'd like to wait a while before delving into Father's memories, she said and stood to leave. It's been great seeing you 2 again. Come say goodbye when you do eventually leave. No, don't be ridiculous, Hildy. Ehrenfeld stood to stop her. We all heard that this suite is yours now. Altmann and I will leave you to your own devices. Hildy didn't respond. She just drifted back down into her armchair with a centite resting on the felt in her hands, staring at it intently. Ehrenfeld shrugged and lifted his quickly into its adjacent case, then closed it. Nodding to Altmann, he left, case in hand. Alcyon, knowing a little about such crystals, was careful to heed the advice to gingerly lift and place the remaining one into the darkly stained wooden case made for it. Then turned to exit as well, but paused to rest his hand on his sister's shoulder. She looked up at him solemnly, eyes brimming with emotion, and nodded. He left her and proceeded to his room, several levels below.